Well, we're happy to have you.
It is insane that there's still no law to protect people from deepfakes. So, very logical, common sense regulation immediately needs to be put in place. And then, the more esoteric type of, what does that look like for humankind can be discussed as we sort of see this technology going forward.
Welcome to Speak Bold. Today, we're talking to Jules Dudko. Born in Ukraine and raised in the US, she's a distinguished Web3 entrepreneur and CEO of FrequenC, which is renowned for steering diverse portfolios, from Fortune 500 companies to celebrities, into the emerging tech world. Leveraging her experience with top-tier brands and her involvement with the Money 2020 Rise Up Europe cohort, she shares her expertise through various high-profile events and outlets. Jules Dudko, thank you so much for joining us on Speak Bold.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, we're very excited to have you, especially because your entrepreneurial journey is a pretty unique one. So tell us how it started.
I took the road less traveled. I wanted to be a lawyer. I was attending the University of Washington, and at the time, something interesting called Instagram and Twitter had started rocking the world, and pretty organically acquired 250,000 followers before being a blogger or influencer was cool. When you used to tell people you were a blogger, they'd be like, ugh, so you make no money. And quickly we saw that shift in the way that individuals and communities and brands were speaking to each other online. And I used that time at university to try to capitalize and build the biggest portfolio I could. So I started traveling around the world, working with brands like Saks to Avion to be able to create creative marketing campaigns. And then during COVID, quickly shifted and understood that, I thought that there was something unsustainable about fashion. And I ended up leading creative and marketing for a brand that was doing 3D printing sunglasses. They were zero waste. And that seemed to me like the perfect blend of technology. So I started going down the rabbit hole of different ways that we could intersect culture and creative with pretty dry technologies. And at the time, I'd stumbled upon Web3 and NFTs, and it was quite early that there was no blueprint. And then I had realized that I'd stumbled upon sort of this new era of communities and individuals speaking to each other again. And so it sort of threw me back to 2013, 2012. Started working pretty organically with DAOs and NFT projects, and the rest is history.
So walk us a little bit more through, you said you had gained quite a following on Instagram. How? I know a lot of people say, I want to be an influencer. How does that happen?
I honestly think if I tried to do it again, I probably couldn't. It was something that was in an era where people were really interested in people that weren't celebrities, and I was just sharing very simple things, and they were just static images. And I remember I was thinking, this is so boring. There should be more filters on Instagram. And we ended up releasing an app that became the #1 app on the App Store called Socialite. And that was my first sort of 19 play at product delivery. It had 20,000 downloads in like 3 weeks. 500,000 people had ended up using it in a very short period of time. So it was different types of activations that I think had sparked a viral movement that at the time was only utilized by celebrities and people who were quite famous.
Speaking of fashion brands and working with fashion brands and being an ambassador for those brands, how do those situations come about? Does Saks Fifth Avenue call you up and say, hey, Jules, we want to work with you?
It's a bit of a catch-22. At some point, nobody wants to work with you, and then it just starts raining and the floodgates open. I was signed with one of the biggest agencies in New York at the time, and I had a manager who would manage my incoming opportunities. And of course, when you're in that, big four circle of New York, London, Milan, and Paris, you basically get thrown in this fashion mix. And at the time, content creators were just becoming very interesting for big brands, just as I had predicted. So, for Saks, it was an activation with several other influencers. For Avion, and it was an activation with the USTA and the US Open to be the first ever US influencer to do an activation in the States.
And for anybody who is not familiar with activation, what does that mean?
It really just depends on a way that the brand wants to engage with you to be able to work together ethically and authentically with your following that aligns, and you can tell a very wonderful story if you can do it well.
All right, so this is where you started to work with a variety of brands. Where do we go from there?
Well, ended up getting older, and I think the biggest thing that really struck me is that it was unsustainable. You know, I would go to fashion weeks, and every single time it was a new bag, it was a new shoe, it was a new outfit, and I knew that I was pushing a narrative that necessarily wasn't sustainable for the world. And so for me, I had started digging deep, trying to understand who was I, the person. I had started doing it very young, and so coming in, trying to understand what message I wanted to share with the world, that sort of sparked that pivot within me that I had to stand for something, and I felt like I had to do something that was different for myself. And everyone thought I was crazy. I had a successful career and then I pivoted, you know, but I believe people are multi-layered, and I think everyone's able to be more than just one thing.
So let's talk about the pivot. What happened next?
Well, the pivot was very scary. I, at the time, ended up getting engaged and my life was changing. I was living in New York, and thankfully I ended up working with this company and several other companies, being able to consult on how we basically use culture ethically to be able to influence people. Because I think right now there's a lot of Machiavellian ways that people can work with people or certain products that are released. And so during that time, sort of trying to find my footing, I think that's where, for me, Web3 had really landed and where I felt like I'd found my vocation. I really believe that molding and being part of being able to mold companies and emerging technologies and being part of that discourse and being able to influence the way people interact with future products really speaks to me.
Before we get into what Web3 can provide us, let's talk a little bit about the Machiavellian stuff. You know, what turned you off about the, I guess, the old way of doing things?
The old way of doing things, I mean, just for example, right now in Web3, there's a conversation of content creators shilling content. And you don't really know who has, you know, who's been sponsored, who's buying it, and what our people incentives are. And I think I saw that very early on in my career, where at the time the SEC hadn't passed regulations that you had to have an ad post, so your followers knew what you were selling.
We all just had to figure it out for ourselves or not.
Yeah, and being part of different agencies, you know, you'd hear of different people who would get paid and wouldn't post about it, certain people who absolutely never would, other people that always did. And it's funny because now there's obviously such a huge conversation about people, you know, sharing tokens and projects that are being sponsored, but this is something that I think has been around for several years. And for me, starting FrequenC, that was absolutely the first thing that I wanted to say and do, was to create a sustainable way of doing things and taking the best of Web 2, but also approaching it in a way that we knew was going to be helpful towards the next generation of users.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about FrequenC. I think a lot of people who have dabbled in the influencer market would love to take control of something like this. Was it difficult? You know, what were those early days like?
The early days were a wild west. FrequenC as a company itself specializes in strategy, marketing, and creative. We don't focus on influencers for this exact reason. I think my prediction was that there was going to be severe government regulation, as we're seeing now with Kim Kardashian, you know, being sued for promoting a token. So I've always worked closely with our internal counsel. Our lawyer is actually our partner, because I believe it is crucial to have your finger on the pulse in terms of understanding how do we navigate a US company correctly in terms of working with, you know, new technologies in an unknown space.
So this is celebrities, musicians, athletes. Has there been any part of this market that has surprised you?
I hate to say it, I don't think anything surprises me. The big thing that I think surprised me in a positive way is the way that the community had reacted to NFTs and Web3. I think why I ended up falling in love with the space is there was so much camaraderie, and there was such a pull of people to make something together at the time when there was no big tech in the space. And you can see how innovative and how collaborative people were to build a piece of the internet together. And those were kind of the glory days for me of, seeing the way that the human spirit works together. There's just stories of someone, saying, hey, can you hold $50,000 for me? And that transfer of $50,000 is made in 20 minutes and then back. And so there's an incredible honorary system that I wish could prevail through some of our more mainstream practices.
Well, so, okay, let's talk a little bit more about Web3. And obviously, you're working on a global scale in a variety of places. Where do you feel like people are missing the mark, and where do you feel like the future is headed?
I think people are missing the mark in the fact that this isn't just a JPEG. This is a technology that has an underlying use case that we probably still don't even know and in which way it's going to evolve. I think the press and the media is so focused on the Bored Apes of the world that they're forgetting that this was actually at the core created to protect creators, to be able to give royalties to people who were traditionally undermined and left out in the dry, especially with, galleries and even, stealing other people's digital work, etc. And so I wish people would hold at the core the principle that this is something that's supposed to empower us.
Many people hear the word Web3, the term Web3, and they think, it's like a Bitcoin thing or it's an NFT thing. I don't really know what that is. And, Bitcoin has lost so much value and it's volatile. How do you explain to somebody what Web3 is, given the crypto landscape that we have today?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that there's so many different rabbit holes you can go down in terms of the blockchain. To me, Web3 is an ideology, first of all. I think we're all in it together to be able to see how farther we can expand a theory of a democratized internet. Of course, that theory then has an underlying technology such as metaverses, NFTs, DeFi, and it's up to the user to be able to go down that rabbit hole of what really speaks to them in terms of Web3. But ultimately, that ideology of Web3, I think it is being able to be part of a democratization where you're able to own a piece of the internet compared to just being a user.
I have to ask about deepfakes. Deepfakes is something that people have been worried about since the dawn of Photoshop, right? They have existed for quite a long time, but they're getting better and better. And so particularly, I think, with your experience with fashion, what do you feel like the landscape looks like there?
I mean, I think just the broad scope of deep fakes, and when you're looking at really important figures having replicated or falsified images, or even normal people, is quite dangerous. I was speaking with a friend of mine who was married to a quite famous celebrity, and he was saying that now in these chats on Reddit, you'd go in and you'd find normal girls and celebrities having, really indiscreet images being placed. And he was just like, this is crazy. This would, if at the time when he told us that he was married, that this would be so damaging for his ex-wife. And it wasn't even an image of her. So I think this opens up a different type of conversation of how it impacts people's careers, how it impacts people's mental health, and how people have to recover from that.
On the flip side, AI can be pretty great for the future of creative, I would think. If you're being optimistic, where would you like it to go, seeing that you're running a creative agency of your own?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting tools in terms of content creation, in terms of curation, in terms of personalization. I think that's a big one for me. I think there is going to be a huge opportunity to be able to use behavioral predictions to create very personalized experiences, sort of like having your own personal AI agent. And, if you plug in like brands that already know what you like to buy, already know where you like to shop, they know like where you like to travel, this becomes a pretty seamless experience in terms of being able to sell and experience things that you really want and help take out unnecessary time and decision making in that process.
So going forward, deepfakes are not going away. They exist, they're getting better, and they fool people. What can we do on the technical side to make sure that the people aren't fooled and the technology isn't being done for nefarious reason?
Yeah, well, this is a question that is top of mind for everybody. I think especially with all of the music crazes right now that we're seeing, the Drake and the David Guetta's copying Eminem's song. I don't know if you're familiar, but David Guetta had played a song to his a sold out concert show, and a couple days later he ended up doing interviews that Eminem actually wasn't involved with the song. He found tools that were able to mimic his writing style and his voice, and of course there was nothing that Eminem could do about it, because right now deepfakes are only protected for people who are impersonating politicians and pornography. And this to me spoke very clearly that there is a use for blockchain, tying it back to how how NFT royalties were protecting creators through Web3. This to me ended up making sense in terms of why don't we apply this with AI? The problem right now in terms of having something as AI royalties is that AI companies are centralized. So essentially, if you can speak with founders and the people who are creating these AI products, you basically have a hooked up end-to-end transaction where you can't, you have to have a new type of smart contract that basically allows the user to be able to get paid every single time their image or their name or their work is mentioned. And of course, there's a lot of technical advances that need to happen to that front, but I do see a way in terms of people being able to even make extra revenues and being able to protect themselves at the same time.
So what about some of these open source AI projects? Open source, a community loves stuff like that. People love to tinker, but it is harder to, if something happens to me, say, how do I pin that on a company? I can't really, right?
Well, it's interesting. I just read this week that Meta actually is for the open source AI revolution, and Google and other big tech obviously wants it closed off because they do want to have the data to be able to excel in competition. So I think this is honestly going to be a very big conversation. Of course, obviously with Sam Altman calling for regulation and a historical briefing with the US government. So I personally, I'm going to be watching this space very closely in terms of how do these, very bold founders and institutions and regulators come to a solution that is able to protect humans and their ideas?
We've got OpenAI being open, but also a company, and some people are a little concerned about what that looks like and who is at fault if things go wrong. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, the historical session with Congress with Sam Altman really, I think, surprised a lot of people that he was calling for regulation. I don't think it's very surprising. I think if you're looking at what's happening with blockchain, it has actually been a problem that there has been no regulation. I think just, with a case like Coinbase, they're being sued for things that are not even laws. They're being their company is going through a tough time because there are no concrete regulations. And so if, we can say that Sam Altman is one of the smartest people of our time. And I think he sees that coming in pretty soon, in the fact that, someone's going to come knocking. And if there are no regulations and strict lines in place for the companies themselves, it's going to take away from the innovation of the whole industry. And of course, regulation is also very important for the way people are going to be interacted with it. And, pushing it back to deepfakes, it is insane that there is still no law to protect people from deepfakes. So, very logical, common sense regulation immediately needs to be put in place. And then, the more esoteric type of, what does that look like for humankind can be discussed as we sort of see this technology going forward.
Many people who are looking forward to our brave new world say, regulation. These people don't know what they're talking about. All they're doing is stymieing cool technology that's going to help us all in the future, and they're living in the past. Is there regulation you think is necessary?
Of course, I believe regulation is necessary. I was asked this question even about Web3. I speak a lot, and the number one question is, should blockchain be regulated? Absolutely. We as a civilization never lived without regulations. We live in a pretty, I think, black and white society in terms of how we should act and what are the consequences of that. So we need to regulate things that could have bad actors that could, really hinder and impact a lot of people if not regulated correctly.
All right, Jules, let's look ahead 20 years, 25. What does AI look like at that point? What do you want it to look like?
I'm always reminded of that episode on Mad Men where they bring the big computer and all of the creatives start freaking out. And this one guy goes crazy because he thinks that the computer is going to take everyone's jobs and they're going to take over people's lives, and it's not going to end well. And I believe we're sort of in that same time period. If you look at us right now, we're engaging with computers. They make us better. We do all of our work on it. We're able to experience things that we never otherwise could have. And it is my hope that we take these tools and this new technology and shape it in a way that is able to make us experience and build things that were never possible, but in a good way.
Have you had somebody ask you recently if AI is going to take their job?
Oh, of course, all the time. I think it's one of the number one questions you get whenever you say, yes, I'm building something in AI. And my answer is always, has a tool ever taken over our lives?
All right, let's move on to Liberty Labs. Why did you found it, and why is it so important to you?
Well, I was born in Ukraine. I moved here when I was very young. I grew up in Seattle. And for me, when I saw the news of the war, it really shook me. And everyone on my team at FrequenC also knew that it had a really deep impact in my life. And I didn't grow up there. And, I don't necessarily have roots. Obviously, I grew up in a Ukrainian household. I love borscht. And my dad and my mom tell me stories of their childhood. But this is something that I was sort of
You're American.
Exactly. And for me, it's hard. I never really put on the immigrant hat. I don't have an accent. I grew up here. So for me, I consider myself American. And my dad had ended up getting involved with the Ukrainian war through charities quite early. And I had visited DC with him earlier this year, where there were a couple of decision makers gathering in the private sector, as well as senators and congressmen who were very keen on helping Ukraine and helping rebuild Ukraine. And at that time, I was fortunate enough to meet with Alexei Goncharenko, and he has launched educational centers through the country. And at the time of the war, basically converted them to be free educational centers that are volunteer-based. And it was interesting to me when we were having conversations about how people would help Ukraine, there was no conversation about blockchain. And, I ended up talking with a few people, and I was just arguing the point that blockchain was actually created for something like this. The central system is broken or at bandwidth and, quite honestly distracted to protect the freedom and the liberties of people, and they're not really thinking about their economic state. And we got to brainstorming with Goncharenko centers that are founded by Alexei. He is a member of parliament in Ukraine, and we've been working since the early to 2023 in terms of being able to provide education, specifically as it relates to Web3 and coding. I believe that education, and it is proven that education is one of the ways to stabilize communities and individuals and families. And so my driving force here was to be able to provide education to anyone who is seeking for relief immediately, to be able to complete a course and being able to apply to a remote job overseas and be able to help themselves in a time of need.
How do you explain to somebody who might be saying, I need food, blankets, shelter, to say, yes, you do need those things, but this is how you actually get out of this?
I think if you look at the history of Ukraine, people have not been very fortunate. There has been a depletion of resources for many decades, if not centuries, if you go back far enough. And so it's nobody's fault that they didn't have access to those resources. So most people didn't even have resources before the war. But, knowing what I know from my family and speaking to friends, people are hungry to work, no pun intended there, but they're very keen to be able to build opportunities for themselves and their families and their communities.
Well, that's amazing. Good on you. That can't be easy because I'm sure there are a lot of people who really need something that you want to help, and everybody's situation is different, but particularly in Ukraine. Kind of opening up this idea of what Liberty Labs is doing for Ukrainians in general. How do you think this could, I don't know, be some sort of an educational project for the greater world?
Well, education should be universal. It's funny, through my journey of finding educational resources, it's funny to see how everyone supports education, but so many of them have a high paywall that people just can't afford. And so we're very lucky to announce our partners who are quite prominent in the Web3 space that have been more than welcome to share everything they could, from the educational materials to introductions, in terms of being able to help. So for me, also connecting with other founders who've done this in other countries and learning their stories and hearing their tips and seeing that this has been happening for quite some time, even before Web3. And there's such beautiful stories of people being able to help out countries, cities, or pockets of communities in terms of education has been really inspiring to me. I'm not focused on the education sector. I never say that I'm an expert here. So for me, the number one thing I wanted to do was surround myself with people and professors and people who were truly experts in this field.
Is there any one instance that comes to mind that you can share with us?
I had connected with an individual who is building an AI model for mental health. And I had actually believed that he was in San Francisco, and his profile said that he was in San Francisco. So I was speaking to him because I felt like maybe there was a way that we can use this mental health bot to help people within Goncharенko centers. And I ended up getting on a phone call with this young man, and it turned out that he had basically been self-taught in terms of building machine learning models. And he was driving this machine learning opportunity in terms of going to the World Health Organization. And, speaking to him in terms of what he was going through, his home was bombed. He had nowhere to go. His co-founder was being called to the front. And he was building this company basically by himself somewhere in a village with bad Wi-Fi. And it's just pretty incredible to see that the power of education has basically helped someone create 3 years ago a company that we're only now talking about in the States. And that's just one experience and one story in Ukraine of the power of education.
So for anybody who might be listening to this saying, okay, sign me up, what advice do you give to anybody, whether they're in a state where they're being marginalized or just curious? Where do you go? Where would you point them to say this is how you get interested in Web3 and then can go from there?
Well, I always say it's the 3 C's: courage, community, and commitment. I think being courageous and curious is one of the best things about being human. I think finding a community that interests you and going down the rabbit hole of getting what in Web3 really speaks of different fun rabbit holes to go down. And commitment. We're all in this, even when it's not necessarily the flavor of the month anymore, right? We're seeing with the press, we know that blockchain and Web3 is a bit cyclical. And so, everyone who's in this space, we're all sort of pushing this boulder uphill. That, everyone can say different things about the boulder. People can think that the boulder needs to be different colors. They could be pushing it in different ways, but ultimately everyone's pushing that boulder up together. And so, sort of understanding that cultural perspective of everyone's intentions, I think is key to be able to blend within the community and finding a place for yourself.
Now, I know you're familiar with the term tech bro. And Web3 bro, I don't know if that's a term yet, but I'm sure it's something that's been thrown around. How do you see females in this brave new world?
I'm always driven by merit. I don't think that the way I look or the way I feel really drives anything besides my actions and my execution. But unfortunately, I do know that there's instances that I probably do miss out on an opportunity because I'm not at a specific dinner or I'm not at some event that is just, a quote unquote tech bro gathering. And, I've sort of made peace with it. For me, there's more than enough pie in the world to go around. I'm a very positive thinker. I think the world is full of abundance. And so, sure, they can have their tech bro dinners, but I think, having a wonderful community of women entrepreneurs and women who support me has probably made me much stronger in terms of having to overcome any type of difficulties. They don't see you coming, you know?
So we've talked about what you've done before and how much you're passionate about Web3, AI, and the future. Are you working on anything new?
Well, indeed, I am. Unfortunately, I got a startup idea that I couldn't get out of my head last year. And, for me, I never want to live with regrets. So I basically started pushing forward, and all of the right things have come together, I think, for a perfect storm. And it's going to be something that is going to help humans be productive, but also being able to help humans feel safe and in control of their AI experience.
Well, that's amazing. All right. So let's, speaking of pivots, let's pivot away from work for a second. What do you do for fun when you're not trying to, make the world a better place?
I honestly dislike this question because I think work-life balance is something that I'm probably going to enjoy after a couple of years of hard work. I do really enjoy time with my family. I just got a wonderful new ragdoll kitten. I have a beautiful house. Yes, I know. And it's just the little things, These things
I want your kitten.
I'm sure he's scratching at our door somewhere. But, I think I've started to realize it's the little things. And even though I could have a 10, 12-hour workday, I've sort of set my life up geographically that I can walk outside and I can walk to the beach and I can enjoy some sunshine. And that really fulfills me as a human. I think taking trips and shopping and, doing other types of hobbies, it is nice to have. But for me, if whenever I'm doing anything else, I just think about the fact that I want to continue working on these products and continue building.
Driven. Yeah.
And that's just something I enjoy doing. And I think finding that vocation to continue back to doing something that you love every day is so strong that it's almost like a magnetic pull. So it doesn't feel like work. You're in the zone, you're performing, and I feel passion like flowing out of me whenever I'm in that flow state.
If somebody comes to you for advice and says, I want what you're doing, or I want to have the access that you have, or I want to somehow get involved in what you have built, what do you say to them?
That is such a great question, and thank you for asking it. That's something that I look forward to doing in the next couple of years, is giving back and being able to mentor people, and especially immigrant and women founders. And the one thing I would say is don't listen to anybody else. If you feel like you have something special to offer or build or say, just do it. People will call you crazy in the beginning, and then it's going to work, and then all of a sudden everyone's going to support you. So don't base your success or the quality of your idea based on what people are saying. If you believe in it, you have to pursue it.
All right, Jules, if people want to find out all that you're working on, where do they go?
Well, you can find out more about my company, FrequenC.com. And you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at Jules on the Daily. And my new favorite platform, LinkedIn, is just Jules Dudko.
On that note, just going to go ahead and thank you, Jules Dudko. Thank you so much for talking to us on Speak Bold.
This was such a great conversation. Thank you for asking such insightful questions, and I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you.
it is insane that there's